In this section, I'd like to talk about the First World War. And when we discuss the First World War, there are a lot of regions we need to discuss, and how alliances were formed, and what were the geopolitical kind of situation of Europe at the time that created this war. And this war was devastating in European history because of the loss of life. And at the end of the war, 8 million men are dead from World War I. We're not even discussing the casualty list from this war. And the Europeans, who thought they were so civilized and had the greatest amount of education and such, had found themselves in this quagmire where, millions of men had died for seemingly very small reasons. So let me first talk about the geographical setup of Europe this time. Remember, we're dealing with empires and kingdoms more than we're discussing this idea of a nation state. Nation states are just emerging still in Europe, and most of the European empire, or the European continent, is made up of empires. So if you go to the Far East, you're discussing the Russian Empire, which was the largest in all of Europe and the largest empire in the world at the time period, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. And the Russian Empire was in a bad state. As I discussed earlier, they had problems with literacy and education. They were slow to industrialize. They didn't have entrepreneurs investing into the local economy, and they were far behind most of the European powers. The greatest amount of investment was coming from France, especially in the end of the 19th century. And this relationship between Russia and France was very strong during this time period, and it's very important to keep that in mind for as to what's going to happen later in the century in many ways. But the European aristocracy was closely related, and the Emperor Nicholas II was the grandson of Queen Victoria. He's also the cousin of the leader of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who he ends up going to war with. They had played together as children at the Queen's Palace in Britain. And so there's this interrelationship among all these great powers and these empires as well. So as I was saying, Russia is in bad shape and not really ready for war in any form or circumstance. To its far west region, it's butted up against two other great empires, the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Germany becomes a place on the map as a united confederation following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. And this is a very important war because under the Prussian leadership, and Prussia was a region of what became Germany. Prussia, East Prussia is in Kaliningrad today, which is on the Baltic coast. Under this Prussian leadership, they had united and fought a very quick-moving war against France in 1870 to 1871. And when that happened, the Germans swept through France and made it their way to Paris very quickly. And when World War I is going to emerge, there's going to be memories of this war taking place. And this is what Germans have in mind when the war begins, that they will be able to repeat what they had done in 1870 to 1871, where they swept through Belgium and then marched their way right to Paris, and Paris capitulated, and Some arrangements were made, and the war was over. It was very quick and neat. To the south of this German Confederation, and then the German Empire, is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is large and unwieldy. It had many different nationalities, and it was having a hard time keeping all these nationalities together and under one emperor, Franz Joseph, in Vienna. And in 1867, the Hungarian nobles had rebelled. They had rebelled in 1848. In 1867, a compromise is made in which Hungary separates with its own diet or parliament, and they have this dual monarchy system where you could have a king of Hungary who's also the emperor in Austria. So we have this Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is really a empire that is in maybe in worse shape than some of the others. And to the south is the crumbling Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans, who had made their way all the way up to Vienna at one point, had been slowly pushed back, and this Eastern question of how they're going to deal with, how the great powers are going to deal with southeastern Europe is really the heart of how or why World War I begins. So you have these three empires: the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which we consider European empires. So we have the more Eastern Empire of the Ottoman Turks to the southeast. All four of these empires at the end of World War I will disappear. They will all crumble, and from the weight of the war in many ways. There's also, to the west, we have an empire as well. We have the British Empire, which was the largest empire on the planet and controlled much of the world's wealth and peoples. The French, at this time period, was a republic, but it had colonial interests in Africa and in Asia. So it acts, although it's a more democratic form of government, as the British Empire was in many ways as well, they both have very strong colonial interests. And this, again, is going to be one of the key components to why this war begins, over this idea of who's going to control these colonies and who has access to gaining more colonies and such. In the northeast region of Europe, we have some small nation states: Belgium and the Netherlands. And Belgium is going to be a victim of World War I, as crossing armies go back and forth, devastating their farmland and such during the war. So we have these empires, and within these empires are aspirations of being a colonial empire in the form of Britain. Britain is the leader, and everybody wants to emulate Britain. Britain had the world's largest navy, and at the time period, to control the seas is to control the markets, is to control the possibility for gaining more industry through colonial exploration of and exploitation of resources. So all these empires are looking to Great Britain as to how to be stronger, and at the same time, Britain is